I heard my son say it, standing in the hospital hallway just outside my room, where he thought I was too drugged from the surgery to make out the words. He said, "Look, Lynn, she had a good run. Let's just find the cheapest place that'll take her and get the house listed before the snow's gone. I'm not putting my whole life on hold for this." He was talking about me, about the woman who'd carried him through pneumonia at 3 and a broken engagement at 26 and a divorce at 40, who had never once in his whole life let him feel like a burden. I had broken my hip on the ice in my own driveway 4 days before, at 74 years old. And I lay in that hospital bed with a row of metal screws holding me together, and I listened to my boy decide, in a hallway, that I'd had a good run, like I was a dog that needed putting down, and that the real order of business was the cheapest bed and the quickest sale of the house I'd lived in for 40 years. What my son did not know, as he stood in that hallway pricing out the end of my life, was that I had done one quiet thing years before, the kind of thing a woman who spent 38 years as a librarian does without anybody noticing. That his whole tidy plan had never once accounted for. By the time he found out, the house he was so eager to list and every decision about my life he assumed was now his to make were going to turn out to be exactly as much his as the moon is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Harriet. I'm 74 years old, and I live in a small town in Minnesota, up in the lake country, where the winters are long and white and serious, and the whole town goes quiet under the snow. And in summer, the loons call across the water at night like something out of an old hymn. I was the town librarian for 38 years. I ran that little Carnegie library on the corner from the time I was 26 until the day I retired. And I knew every reader in this town, what they checked out and what they were too ashamed to check out, and what they were quietly going through by the books they came looking for. A librarian learns a town the way a country doctor learns a body. Quietly, completely, and without ever once letting on how much she knows. And a librarian learns something else too, the thing that saved me in the end. She learns to read the fine print. She spends 38 years teaching frightened people that the answer is almost always written down somewhere, that you are not helpless if you will only go and find the document and read all the way to the bottom of it, including the parts written small. I taught half this town to find what they needed in the records. It never once occurred to my children that their mother might have read the fine print of her own life more carefully than anyone. I want you to hold on to that, the part about how much a quiet woman knows and how carefully she has read, because it matters a great deal to how this ends. My children looked at their mother and saw a sweet, fading old lady who used to shelve books. They forgot, the way people do, that the woman who shelves the books is the one who has read every single one of them and remembers. There is one thing I did, years ago, a quiet bookkeeping sort of thing, that I'll come back to, because it turned out to be the hinge the whole story swings on. But you have to understand first what kind of woman I was to my family all those years, because you cannot feel what they did to me unless you know what I'd done for them. So let me start at the beginning, which for me has always meant starting with somebody else's need. I have been a caregiver my whole life, not as a job, just as the shape my life took, the way water takes the shape of whatever holds it. I nursed my own mother through 5 years of Parkinson's in the back bedroom of this house, spooning her supper and turning her at night and reading to her when her hands could no longer hold a book. I nursed my father after his strokes until he passed, right here, in the same room. I raised 2 children, Dennis and Lynn, and I was the mother who sat up with every fever with a cool cloth, who drove to every away game 2 counties over, who kept a drawer of clean clothes for the neighbour kids whose own homes came apart, who never once sent a hungry child away from my kitchen. When Vern, my husband, got sick at the end, congestive heart failure, 2 long years of it, I cared for him every single day, learned to manage the oxygen and the pills and the swelling, and I held his hand when he went, right here in this house, 6 winters ago. And I did not let him see me cry until it was over, because I did not want fear to be the last thing he felt. And in between all of that, for 38 years, I tended a whole town from behind a library desk. You think a library is just books. It isn't. It's the warmest public room in a cold town. I found the right book for the grieving widow and the frightened pregnant teenager, and the man who'd lost his job and couldn't say so to a living soul. And I never let on that I knew. I just slipped the right thing into their hands and let them think they'd found it themselves. I gave my whole life, every last bit of it, to being the one who shows up. I never resented it, not for a day. It was who I was, and I was glad to be her. I just never once stopped to think about who would show up for me. Because a woman like me does not let herself imagine ever being the one in the bed. We can't afford to. The whole arrangement runs on our never imagining it. Let me set this down a moment, because I've been talking a while, and it would warm me to know who's keeping an old librarian company tonight. Wherever you are, whatever town, leave it down below where I can see it. The lake country gets awful quiet in the winter dark, the kind of quiet that has a sound to it, and a little company. Even the kind I'll never see is no small thing to a woman alone in it. There now, where was I? The kind of woman I was, and what being her got me in the end. On the ice by my own back step. My children grew up and did well, by the world's measure, and moved away, the way children are supposed to. Dennis went down to Minneapolis and does something in commercial real estate, which I mention only because it turned out to matter a great deal. A man whose whole training is to look at a house and see a number instead of a home. He's got the big house in the suburbs and the boat and the second wife, and a calendar he guards like a vault. Lynn stayed closer, an hour off, and she's softer than Dennis, but weaker too. The kind of soul who feels just terrible about a thing, and then does the easy thing anyway, and feels terrible about that next. Around and around, mistaking the feeling bad for a kind of virtue. They called on Sundays. They came at Christmas and left on the 26th. And I told myself that was plenty. Because telling yourself it's plenty is the silent second half of the caregiver's bargain. You give everything, and you teach yourself to ask for nothing. And then, one ordinary icy morning, you find out precisely what nothing has bought you. I fell on the 3rd of February, on the patch of ice by my own back step, the step Vern always used to salt. I lay in the cold a long while before the mail carrier found me, and that was its own kind of lesson, lying there in the snow, realizing that not one living soul was going to come looking for me, that I could lie there till spring, and the first to notice would be the gas man. They took me in for surgery, screws and a plate. And the surgery went fine, as these things go. It was everything after the surgery where my family showed me who they'd decided I was. Because a broken hip at 74 is not really about the bone. The doctors will tell you that. It's about what comes after. The long, hard months of rehabilitation. The question of whether you'll walk again and live on your own again, or whether this is the door closing on the whole back half of your life. And that question, it turns out, doesn't get answered by the patient. It gets answered by who shows up to fight for her recovery. And nobody fights for the recovery of a woman they've already decided is finished. I want to tell you how the abandonment actually went, beat by beat, because it didn't come as one cruel blow. It came as a slow, reasonable, well-mannered drift. And that's how most people are really abandoned, not with a slammed door, but with a series of perfectly understandable excuses. First, it was the hospital. Dennis flew up for exactly 1 day, sat in my room for an hour with his coat on and his phone in his hand, and spent most of that hour out in the hallway on calls, including the one I overheard. Lynn came more, but Lynn came to wring her hands, to tell me how stressful this all was for her, to cry a little at my bedside so that somehow I ended up comforting her, patting her hand from my hospital bed with my hip full of screws, telling my own daughter, there, it'll be all right. That's a particular talent the lifelong caregiver never loses, even flat on her back. We'll comfort you about our own dying. Then came the facility. The hospital can't keep you once the acute part is past, so there's the choosing of a rehabilitation place. And this is where Dennis, the real estate man, took charge. Because Dennis takes charge of anything involving a price. He did not choose the good place, the one with the bright therapy gym and the high recovery rates that my insurance would have largely covered. He chose the cheapest bed in the county, a grim, understaffed warehouse 40 minutes from anyone I knew. Because, he explained, we have to be smart about the money, Mom. This could go on a while. Be smart about the money. My money, he meant. The money he'd already started thinking of as his. And then the visits thinned out, the way they always do. Lynn came twice the first week, once the second. Then it became phone calls. Then it became texts. Then it became a single text from Dennis saying he'd come up when things settled down at work. Things did not settle down at work. Things never settle down at work for the people who have quietly decided not to come. The work is just the respectable name they give the deciding. I lay in that cheap facility, in a room that smelled of bleach over something worse. And I did my exercises alone when I did them at all. And I watched the other forgotten old people parked in that hallway in their wheelchairs. The ones whose families had also discovered, one by one, that things were terribly busy at work. And I felt the precise thing I had spent my entire life making certain no one in my care ever felt. I felt like a piece of furniture nobody had room for anymore. I felt like a burden. The people I loved were just waiting, politely, to be allowed to set down. But the part that broke something in me that I'm not sure ever fully mended, the part I'll carry to my grave, was the house. I found out by accident, which is how you always find out the cruelest things. Never head on, always sideways, from someone who assumes you already know. A woman from my church, one of the few souls who actually drove out to see me, was chattering to fill the silence, and she let it slip, easy as anything, that she'd seen my Dennis walking the property with a realtor, a clipboard, the two of them pointing up at the roofline, and that the word around town was the lake house would list in the spring once the market warmed up. My house. The house I had nursed my mother in, and my father, and my Vern. The house with Vern's pencil marks still climbing the kitchen doorframe. Dennis, age 4. Lynn, age 6. Every year notched into the wood. My children had looked at me, lying broken in a rehabilitation bed, privately concluded I was never walking back through that door, and begun, while I was still very much alive and breathing 40 minutes away, to sell my home out from under me and divide the proceeds in their heads. They were settling my estate, and I wasn't dead. I was only inconvenient, which to certain people is near enough the same thing to start the paperwork. I have to be fair, even now, because the truth always has more than one room, and lying awake in that place, I made myself find the other rooms. Dennis, I think, had genuinely convinced himself it was mercy. That's the thing about a man who sees the world in numbers. He can dress nearly anything up as the sensible, responsible choice, and never once feel the cruelty in it, because cruelty isn't a number. He'd decided I was done, and so getting the cheapest place and selling the asset was just good stewardship. And if you'd called it abandonment to his face, he'd have been genuinely wounded. And Lynn, my Lynn, she knew it was wrong. I'm sure of that. I saw it in her face every time she couldn't quite meet my eyes. But Lynn had spent her whole life letting Dennis make the hard decisions, so she wouldn't have to. And being swept along while feeling terrible was simply the only way she knew how to be. They were not monsters. They were just weak and busy and a little greedy, which is so much more common than monstrous, and does so much more of the damage in this world. That was the season I stopped fighting. And I need you to hear this part, because it's the most dangerous part. I didn't rage. I didn't weep and carry on. I just quietly began to agree with them. Alone in that bleach-smelling room, with no one coming, with my own children having priced out my ending, I started to believe it. I started to think, well, maybe Dennis is right. Maybe I am done. Maybe a woman who can't get out of a chair without help has no business in a house by a lake. No business taking up space and money and her children's precious time. I stopped doing my exercises with any heart. I started sleeping in the afternoons, which is how it begins, the giving up. It looks just like rest. The doctors have a cold phrase for what happens to old people who get warehoused and forgotten after a fall. They call it failure to thrive. It is a polite way of saying that a person who is given no reason to come back simply doesn't. I was failing to thrive. I had decided to. It was, God forgive me, almost a relief to finally set down the weight of being unwanted. And I'll be honest with you, because this is the truest part. I had begun to die on purpose. Slowly, quietly, politely, the way I'd done everything. I was going to spare them even the trouble of waiting. And then my granddaughter Becca walked into that room. Now I have to tell you about Becca, because Becca is the whole turn of this story. And to understand her, you have to understand that she was the one my family had thrown away long before they ever thought of throwing away me. Becca is Lynn's girl, 23 years old. She dropped out of college after one hard year. She got pregnant at 20 by a boy who was gone before the second trimester, and she had the baby anyway, a little boy named Theo, and she was raising him alone, working doubles at the Lakeside Cafe and cleaning the summer people's cabins on the side, living in a rented half a duplex with a water stain on the ceiling. And the family was ashamed of her. Oh, they were careful how they said it. They used soft words, but the words were knives all the same. Dennis called her the cautionary tale, at a Thanksgiving once, with a little laugh, and everyone at the table laughed along, and I have never forgiven myself that I didn't say something then. Lynn was forever sighing over her, wringing her hands, telling anyone who'd listen how Becca had thrown her whole life away, as though a living, breathing grandchild named Theo were a thing thrown away. Becca was the family's failure, the black sheep, the one whose name got said with a little drop and a little pause. The example held up to the younger cousins of what not to become. And here is the thing not one of them ever noticed, because not one of them ever looked at Becca with anything but disappointment. That girl who had nothing, who was scratching and scrambling every single day just to keep herself and her baby fed and warm, was the only person in the whole family who knew, from the inside, in her own bones, exactly what it is to be looked at like you're a problem to be managed and a shame to be hidden. And being looked at that way her whole young life had done the opposite to her of what it did to the others. It had not made her hard, it had made her merciful. The thrown-away girl was the only one of them who knew how it felt to be thrown away, and so she was the only one who could not stand to watch it done to someone else. She heard about the house. Somebody let it slip to her the way it had been let slip to me and Becca. 23, broke, with a toddler on her hip, got in her rusted-out Corolla and drove 40 minutes to that facility to see if it was true. And she found her grandmother lying in a dim room in the afternoon, turned toward the wall, not eating, halfway out the door of this life. She told me later what it looked like to her, walking in. She said it looked like I'd been put somewhere to be forgotten. And she said something rose up in her that she'd never felt before, a kind of fury, because she knew that look. She'd been put somewhere to be forgotten her whole life too. And she set Theo down on my bed, and that baby grabbed my finger, and Becca said, "Grandma, Grandma, look at me. This isn't happening. I'm getting you out of here." And she did. I want to slow down here, because what that girl did over the next months is the part I'll be telling in heaven. She couldn't take much time off. She'd have lost both her jobs, and she and Theo were already living one bad week from disaster. So she did it in the cracks of a life that already had no cracks left in it. She showed up. That's the whole secret. The entire secret. The one my successful, calendar-guarding children never learned in all their years of success. She just showed up. Every single day she possibly could, with Theo on her hip and dark circles under her eyes, straight off a diner shift, still smelling of coffee and bacon grease. She got me eating again, not by lecturing me about my strength like the staff did, but by bringing me the foods I actually loved. The wild rice soup from the cafe in town, a proper hot dish, a thermos of real coffee instead of the grey facility dishwater. She got me doing my exercises again by simply doing them with me. The two of us and a giggling baby marching up and down that grim hallway like the world's most ridiculous parade. And I would not quit in front of that child. I found, no matter how much I wanted to quit for myself, she asked the questions nobody else had bothered to ask, because nobody else had thought I was worth the trouble of a hard question. She found out, just by asking plainly, that my insurance would in fact have covered the good rehabilitation place all along, the bright one with the real therapy gym, the one Dennis had sworn we couldn't afford while he priced out the cheapest bed in the county. She got me moved there. She learned the names and the doses of all my medications and kept them in a little notebook. She sat across from my doctors and really talked to them, took notes, asked the one question that changes everything, which is not, is she going to be all right? It's, what would it actually take for her to walk again? And then she went and did every single thing they said it would take. She gave me the one medicine my family had decided I wasn't worth the cost of. She gave me somebody who believed I was coming back and behaved every day as though it was simply a fact we were both working toward. And slowly, because at last somebody on this earth expected me to, I began to come back. The afternoon I let go of the parallel bars and took 3 steps to Becca on my own, with Theo clapping his fat little hands. I cried harder than I had at any funeral, because 3 months earlier, I had quietly decided to die in a bleach-smelling room to spare everyone the bother. And here was a girl with nothing who had refused, flatly refused, to let me. It was around then that I remembered the quiet thing I'd done years ago, the librarian's thing, and understood it was about to matter very much. You see, after Vern died, I'd done my affairs properly, the way a careful, well-read woman does, sitting at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and a good estate attorney over in the county seat, a sharp woman named Ms. Ndai. And I had never, not ever, put my children's names on the deed to this house. I'd never signed over power of attorney. I'd never made Dennis the joint owner of my accounts, no matter how he'd hinted over the years that it would be simpler. The house was mine, solely and entirely mine, and every decision about my life and my money remained mine and mine alone, for exactly as long as I was of sound mind. And here was the thing my real estate son, in all his taking charge, had never once stopped to check, because it never occurred to him that the sweet old lady shelving books had read the fine print of her own life. He had no legal right to sell my house. None. He'd been walking realtors through a property that was not his, planning the sale of a home he did not own and could not touch, all on the unexamined assumption that a woman in a rehabilitation bed had stopped being a person whose signature was required. I was still that person. I had made very sure, years before, that I always would be. So once Becca had me strong enough to hold a pen and think straight, which the good facility and her stubborn, furious love accomplished in about 2 months, I made some telephone calls of my own. I called Ms. Njai, my attorney over in the county seat, and we made everything very clear, and very legal, and very final, the way a careful woman likes things. I'd like to tell you there was a grand and terrible confrontation, but the truth was quieter than that, and far more devastating for being quiet. I simply came home. Becca drove me, with Theo babbling away in his car seat and a fresh hot dish on the floorboard, up the road to my own house by the lake that had never for one instant stopped being mine. And I walked back in through my own front door on a walker, slow and trembling, but on my own 2 feet. 2 months after my son had stood in a hallway and decided I'd had a good run. And word reached Dennis that his mother was home and lucid, and that the house he'd been quietly showing to realtors was not now and never had been his to sell, and that the bank accounts he'd assumed he'd be tidily managing answered to exactly one person on this earth, and she was very much alive and walking down to her own lake every morning. There was a great deal of bluster on the telephone after that. There was a sudden, miraculous, overnight return of Dennis's deep concern for my well-being. There was Lynn, weeping down the line, saying she had always meant to be there. She'd just been so overwhelmed. She'd had no idea it was so bad. And I let them say all of it, every word, the way you let a late spring snow come down, knowing the ground's already too warm for it to last. And then I did the one genuinely hard thing in this whole story. And I did it stone sober and clear-eyed, not in anger. I had Ms. Di change my will. I left this house, the house by the lake with Vern's pencil marks climbing the doorframe, to Becca, to the granddaughter they had all thrown away, years before they ever got around to throwing away me, the one who turned out to be the only person of my blood who knew how to love somebody who could do absolutely nothing for her in return. I did not do it for spite, and I made sure they understood that, because spite is just one more thing I've no use for at my age. I did it because a house ought to go to the person who proved to you it was a home. And Becca, who owned nothing in this world but a rusted Corolla and a good heart, had proved that to me in a bleach-smelling hallway. And my children, who owned nearly everything, had shown me a spreadsheet and a realtor's clipboard. I told them so, plainly, without once raising my voice. Because 38 years at a quiet desk taught me that the calm word, said one time and meant, lands harder than the loud word shouted 10. I said, "You decided I was finished, and you started selling my home while I was still breathing inside it. Becca decided I was worth fighting for, and she had nothing on this earth to fight with but her own 2 hands. I am not punishing anyone. I am simply giving what is mine to the one who showed up. That is the only thing an inheritance has ever truly been. And most people just never have to find it out this plainly." I'm 74 years old, and I'm home, in my own house by the lake, and I walk now with a cane, all the way down to the water and back every morning, that the path isn't too iced over. And every single step is a small argument I am winning against the people who priced out my ending. Becca and little Theo moved in with me, into the back bedroom where I once nursed my own mother through her last years. And the strangest, sweetest thing has happened to that room. It used to be the dying room of this house. 3 people breathed their last in it. Now it is the most alive room in the place, full of a toddler's shrieking and clattering, and a young woman's laughter, and the smell of crayons and apple juice. 3 generations under Vern's old roof. And I think Vern would split his face grinning to see it. Becca finished a nursing aid course that I was only too glad to help her pay for. And she is good at it. Of course she is good at it. She was always good at it. The whole family just had it exactly backwards, about which of their children had thrown a life away and which one had quietly been saving them all along. She works at the very rehabilitation place that helped bring me home. And the old people there adore her. And why wouldn't they? She is the one who shows up. Dennis and I are cordial now, in the careful way of people who both know exactly what happened and have agreed not to say it out loud. Lynn is trying, slowly, coming around in her hand-wringing way, and I let her. And I'm kind to her, because the porch light stays on. It always stays on. But I have learned, at long last and at great cost, that you can leave the light on for people and still not hand them the keys. That forgiveness and trust are 2 different rooms, and you are allowed to live in one without opening the other. People think the cruelest betrayal is a dramatic one, a theft, a lie, a slammed door. But I have learned there's a quieter one that cuts deeper, and it's the betrayal of being quietly set down, of giving your whole life to people, every fever and every ball game and every sleepless night, and then breaking your hip on the ice and discovering that the love you spent 80 years pouring out apparently never filled a single cup you could drink from, when you were the one who was thirsty. That nearly killed me, It nearly killed me on purpose. What saved me wasn't my children, with all their success and their nearness and their Sunday phone calls. What saved me was the one they'd all written off, the girl with nothing, who knew how to show up because she knew how it felt when nobody did. So if you are out there tonight, the one who's always been the strong one, the one who shows up for everybody, let me tell you the hardest thing I learned, flat on my back in a place that smelled like bleach. You will find out who really loves you on the day you can do nothing for them. Not the day you're useful, not the day you're generous, not the day you're hosting Christmas. The day you're just a body in a bed that needs turning, and there's nothing in it for anybody to show up. That's the day the truth walks through the door. Or doesn't. And it is so often not the ones you spent your life on. It is so often the one nobody was looking at. So look at them. Look at the ones the world's decided don't count. Love is a debt that comes due all at once, on the worst day of your life. And you had better hope you spent a little of it on somebody who shows up for reasons that aren't on any spreadsheet. If this story found you tonight, stay a while and I'll have another for you soon. And tell me, down below, who showed up for you when the people who should have didn't? And where in this world are you keeping me company from tonight? I read every single one. Take care of yourself. And go look twice at the one your family decided didn't matter. They might be the only one who does.